So I can start maybe. I just find migrations to be really difficult and confusing. And I've only done 2 migrations. One was a 6 to 7 a long time ago, and one was a 7 to 8 that started about a year ago and finished about 6 months ago. And then I'm just starting one now that's migrating just blogs from a WordPress site to a Drupal 8 site. And there I actually started to use the feeds module instead of migrate because I thought it might be easier with an interface and stuff. So yeah.
Did it turn out to be easier?
So far it is, in terms of the blog is pretty simple, and the blog post has just got a title. It's got a body which has a whole bunch of embedded images in the body. It has some tags, so they become taxonomy. So those things have migrated, or I shouldn't call it migrate, but got pulled in with feeds. Okay, the title, the body, the 2 types of tags. What's remaining to do is this one featured image. So I remain to do that. And what I really get confused about is media. Like, how do you take an image file over here, like over in WordPress or over in Drupal? Well, I know how to do it in Drupal 7 because I did it, but it seems complicated. How do you take that, an image over here, and make it media over on the Drupal 8 site? And then hook that media into the field that's using it on the content type that you migrated, you know? So like I said, I did that for a Drupal 7 site, so I know it's possible, but I have no idea how you would do it with a WordPress site. And I know the answer to that is probably not simple. So
sorry, I just arrived and missed the first half of your question. What is hard to do in a WordPress site?
So I just find migrations hard, period. And then I've only done 2 migrations. One is from a 6 to a 7, and one is more recent from a 7 to 8. So I've done them, but I just find them difficult. I'm just starting a migration from WordPress to Drupal where all I have to migrate are blog posts. So I actually started doing it with feeds in Drupal 8, thinking that would be somehow easier because there's a nice interface in feeds and all that stuff. And I'm getting there.
I would definitely say do migration. I thought, let me Google this. I thought that there was a WordPress plugin for Migrate.
There is. I started to use that, and it says to export the WordPress stuff as XML. But when you do that, the XML for blog posts is weird. It doesn't actually contain the categories in it or anything like that. It does. So it's just weird XML. So I kind of gave up and exported as CSV instead. And then started to use feeds. But yeah, it would be better to use Migrate, I guess.
I mean, you could go right against the database. Just, you know, make a MySQL migration.
Yeah, that's maybe part of the confusion. Not so much when you're going from Drupal to Drupal, but if you're going from anything else to Drupal, what are the possible methods and which one should you try first? Like, should you try to export as a CSV and use that for the migration? Should you try to hook into the database and use that for the migration, or what? Well,
I think I'm about to give you an answer you were about to dread. That depends.
Yeah.
It all depends on what your source data is and how easy it is to get stuff out of it, and like you said, how easy the database is to parse up on your own, or you know, your data source. Like I said, hooking into a MySQL database isn't difficult. I'm again almost positive there is a MySQL plugin already. I think I may have had to write a custom source for that at one point, but I don't know that you do anymore.
One
SQL source. Yeah, no, it just kind of supports it natively. What's the name of the plugin? It is Custom SQL Migrate Source plugin. Oh yeah, wow! This one now actually lets you do you can specify a query right in your source config. I'm sorry, someone started talking at the same time I did, and I didn't stop. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was going to mention, like, you mentioned that going from 6 to 7 and from 7 to 8, I just want to acknowledge that the system are completely different. Like Drupal 7 was PHP based for the most part. In Drupal 8, we have, it's under the hood, everything is converted to PHP code, I guess, but initially it's YAML based, and the architecture and the options are a little bit different. So I would, like, I have done probably many migrations in 8 plus, like 8 or 9, and not as many in 7. And it's a completely different mindset sometimes. So it's relatable. One thing that I would suggest is that we all maybe introduce ourselves and share, a problem or an idea or a challenge or something that we would like to take from this conversation. Based on the schedule, we only have about 30 more minutes. So if we see some common patterns, we can then address them in batches.
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, well, hi.
There was a long pause. I guess I can introduce first. So I'm Jack Franks. I'm a mostly backend Drupal 8 developer, and boy, I love Migrate. Drupal 8 Migrate is one of my favorite core functions. I don't know if it's gauche to point back to your own talks, but I've got a bunch of talks on it from MidCamps before that might help you out if you're really trying to put custom stuff together for Migrate, not just some Drupal version to some other Drupal version. Migrate is so much fun. I don't have any particular problem. I just like talking about it.
I'd love to share what I did on that 7 to 8 migration and see if that was the right way to do it at some point.
Hi, I'm Benji Fisher, one of the maintainers of the migration subsystem.
My name is Mauricio Dinarte. I've been doing migrations for 4 or 5 years, and I've been enjoying the challenge of learning and documenting the API along the way.
Also, if you look in the chat, someone's posted a link to a place where we can share notes. So Jack, if you'd like to post in the link to some of your presentations, if that's possible. And Mauricio, you could always post in the link for the 31 Days of Migration series.
I'm Joe. I have some experience with migrations. I don't have any particular questions and was more just kind of curious to come and see what other people were doing with migrations and learn something along the way.
I'm sort of in the same boat. I'm Noelle, and I work in there's two of us Drupal folks where I work, and we have about a handful of Drupal 7 sites that we need to migrate. Obviously, we're a little bit behind in that area, and we're also any new sites that we create going forward, of course, we're going to do in Drupal 9. But I just kind of wanted to, join this group or join this session and hopefully learn a little something, get some tips, etc. For going from 7 to 9 is my area of interest, I guess.
My name is Brian, and yeah, I'm also interested in 7 to 9 migration, which we're going to be doing later on this year and next year. I really don't have experience with migration. We did a project last year that we migrated from a .NET website into Drupal 8 site, and I was involved with planning on mapping out fields and things, but the whole mechanics and coding the actual migration script, somebody who knows more about that stuff did.
And I'm Terry, and I have and did an incomplete. I have to say it was incomplete because I never did get quite finished. 6 to, I think it was 8.6 migration about a year ago. And one of the issues was exactly what Rick was talking about, and that is how to handle bringing in assets into media in 8/9. So I'm going to have to revisit that particular migration again. And because the Drupal 6 site is still up, I never did get it 100% going. So it's still there. I got to finish it, obviously. But in the process, I also managed to accidentally blow away the database that I had migrated to. So I'm really looking at starting all over and going into 9.1, and perhaps I'm curious also about, I mean, at this point now, the site would be on PHP 7.4. As soon as I can get it into PHP 8, I would do that. And just wondering if that makes any difference in terms of how you would handle any of these migration issues.
So for anyone just getting started, I recommend Mauricio's series of blog posts, which he pasted a link into the document. On the question of getting things into media, the general process is you first do a migration that creates file entities. One way of saying that is that you're populating the file manage table. And then you have the second migration with the same source that, that creates media entities corresponding to the file entities. So I've done that many times. I obviously have a bias towards the Migrate API. So keep that in mind when I give the advice that use feeds only if it's easy. If it's hard, use the Migrate API.
One comment that I would like to add to that is sometimes I see people, especially in Slack, where the community offers support, like jumping too fast into writing the migration. And I would encourage everyone to take a step back and try to understand both your source and your destination very well. And in particular, something that is going to help you a lot when you face challenges is like understanding the relationship among different entities in Drupal. Like, okay, for example, if I have a media field in a node, I need to be able to identify what are all the entities that are related to that. So I have a node entity, I have a media entity, I have a file entity. So understanding that I have 3 different entities that I need to create in order for these to like glue together, that is going to give me a clue as to how to approach the process. For the most part, and this is the general recommendation, there are always exceptions. You're going to have one migration per entity. So one for the file, one for the media entity, and one for the node, and then you should be able to connect them. And that is something that I see often, like if you, in a node you have taxonomy terms, anything that is a entity reference field or an entity reference revision field like paragraph, that is going to give you a clue that is going to be very likely a different migration, and you need to be able to establish that relationship about among the different entities. That being said, also like understanding your source is key. And from then on, it's just like understanding your tools. So one of the best things is like there is a page in the documentation about list of process plugins. If that's weird or you're not familiar with that concept, I recommend researching about that. But it's just like the tools that you will have at your disposals to work on your migration. So it's like understand in general Drupal site building concepts, understand how the site is modeled in your source and your destination, and then understand the tools that are available. I have pasted some links specifically about how to get started, to series, to articles, and to podcasts in the shared document.
One of the things that I've done and has been super helpful for me, especially working on with a team, is part of like trying to understand the source site is a lot of work in spreadsheets initially. And we'll do things like create a spreadsheet that has a list of all of the modules on the Drupal 7 site and start to figure out like, is there a Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 version of this module? Yes or no? Is there a Drupal 8 version, but it is a different module? So like the community has coalesced around a different contrib module in Drupal 8 than in Drupal 7, and kind of getting a picture of that. And then we also frequently will make a spreadsheet that contains a list of like all of our content types, basically all of our like entities on the Drupal 7 site and all of the fields for each one, and basically start creating notes of like, this is what we need to do to migrate this particular field. And we often find that like some of them are, a lot of times, like migrating a particular content type, it's really easy except for like one field that you have, you know, it's like, oh, we're trying to change the name of it, or this field type doesn't exist anymore, just whatever weird things like that. And being able to look at that document where we have kept notes as a team about like, essentially like, these are the parts we already know how to move, and these are the parts that we don't know how and we need to figure out.
That makes sense. We've been doing something similar, trying to get ready for our migrations. Just kind of, and it goes back to understanding the source
Mm-hmm.
and the destination. And if I'm not mistaken, does the migration module, or am I thinking of something else, actually give you suggestions, you know, if a module doesn't exist in 7, what the community recommends or is gravitating toward? There's a tool somewhere that I found, but it's been a minute since I've looked at those notes.
The migrate upgrade module, I think that's
migrate update. That's it.
I think that like the module itself, I don't know if it gives suggestions, but that when you mentioned that, I thought of the upgrade status module that you run through the UI, and you get a report of the availability of modules in Drupal 8 or 9, and
Yeah.
then what are options for things that are not available. That is migrate. Excuse me. That is upgrade status.
Yeah, I think that is it, actually.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, so I found the link.
And that's useful. I think it also tells you what's in core in Drupal 8.9 that wasn't in 7, like views, for example.
Mm-hmm.
These are always such interesting sessions because the talk is so often about these, you know, Drupal version updates, but by far that is the least common thing that I use Migrate for. I use it for everything and only rarely have to update sites.
Lucky?
I recently came up with an interesting use where we're building a new site. It's not migrated from anything. But while we're building it, the content editors are, of course, copying and pasting links. So they start with, you know, my site at hosting.com/about us. So you can use the Migrate API to search through all of the body fields in all of your nodes and replace links that start with, you know, mysite.hosting.com/ and just snip that part off.
One other thing that I would recommend for anyone either learning in preparation for an upcoming project or already doing the work is for, you know, anything, and this is goes beyond Migrate, for anything that you want to learn, try to look for an example and try to make the example work for you. Like in the case of the migration, you know, look for an example online and try to get it working locally. And it's easy, especially with the Migrate API and how YAML files are written, to make mistake. One extra space, one missing space can break your whole migration. So starting from a point where you know that it is supposed to work, and you get that working, you have made progress already, and from there you can start either tweaking the migration to fulfill your specific needs, or breaking the migration on purpose to get yourself familiarized with the errors, so that when they happen in the future, you don't get caught, like by surprise. You are already familiar with this type of errors, and you know what might the cause of the source of them. So um, yeah, that's something that I found myself very useful to do. And I have posted in the shared document links to different examples that I have written myself, and some of them include accompanying articles with the explanation. But for example, in there, there is one example that is about migrating media. So you can start with that if you want to learn how to migrate media. It goes from, create the files, create the video entities, create the nodes, and connect everything together. But in general, I would advise to look for working examples and start from there.
And Rick pasted something into the document using the migrate upgrade module and then running migrations by Drush. Yeah, that's a very common workflow. One thing you didn't mention is that once you've exported them as configuration, you have the option of editing them and tweaking them to your heart's content. And then, there are a whole lot of them. It really helps to have a simple bash script that runs them in the right order. Sometimes the order that's detected isn't quite right. And it's an iterative process. So, be prepared to wipe out your database and start again from scratch every time you do a tweak, and work on one problematic migration at a time.
Yep, I did that a lot. So migrations in general are all in YAML files. Usually you don't need anything more than that, right?
I often write a custom process plugin or two, and then I often end up contributing them back to the Migrate Plus module.
Okay.
Yeah, when working on some projects, I will also have had the need to write source plugins from time to time to, prepare the data, to sometimes clean up the data as part of the migration process in a source plugin. Something that I have never done is writing a destination plugin, other than by just curiosity, but as a need in a real project, that has never been the case. But that being said, something that I really enjoyed about the Migrate API starting in Drupal 8 is that because it is YAML based, you don't need to be a programmer to write migrations, and you can go a really long way without having to resort to writing code. One of the examples that I pasted there is a full day workshop where you never touch PHP at all. So it is possible to do a lot. I mean, of course, if you know how to program, you will have more tools at your disposal. But even if you don't, it is possible to do a lot.
So I heard Mauricio say one migration per entity. And then I heard Joe talk about fields. So my question is, in my Drupal 7 site, my media entities have a field for image, a field for caption, and a field for photo credit. If I set all those fields up in the new site, can I do one migration that brings in all three at once?
Pulling in your data fields and your media fields, your picture fields, anything that if you have an image field on there, that will often use a file entity and reference it. Those you need to split up. Well, you don't need to split up. You can do them all in one go, but it's way more difficult to manage. It's way more difficult to roll back. So I would do all of your regular data fields in one migration, and then any of your sort of dependency-based fields like files in a separate relation or migration with a lookup plugin.
Or
okay.
or first do the file migration and then do one migration that does all of the fields on the media entity. So one of those will be the reference to the file field, and the others will be your, well, whatever text fields you had or whatever.
There you go. That was clearer than how I described it. Yes.
I will look for a screenshot that explains some of these, like the relationship between entities and how you can migrate them. We're trying to find it now.
Okay, thanks.
What other challenges or success stories have people had with the Migrate API or migration projects in general?
Or there's some questions in chat. David, do you want to read out your question? Or I can read it for you. Are any folks considering or doing a migration without a redesign, more or less the same UX, but the backend is now D9? I've never seen that happen. People often say that's what they want, but it always ends up being more complicated than that.
Yeah, it doesn't look like David is still in the room.
Okay. And Joe posted a link to the upgrade status module, which I think I also pasted into the shared doc. Mauricio, how long will this shared doc be available?
It's supposed to live as long as the internet lives, but we might, create a backup just in case.
Okay, since it's quiet, I'll go again. Another thing that I like to use Migrate for is, you know how for some entity items, for menu config, you can export that as configuration, but for content-based menu entries, you can't export those. So something I use Migrate for during my, my script for site setup is having a migration that, it just sets up all of your menus in it from a source data file. And that includes all the text links, permissions and setups and everything.
So rather than use something like the default content module, you'll use the Migrate API?
I find Migrate so much easier to use than default content.
And then what kind of source do you use?
CSVs mostly, but it doesn't have to be. Anytime something gets more complicated, it just needs a more complicated source. But for almost everything that I do, I just use a CSV.
Is it possible to share screens? I'm not sure.
Sure.
Okay. I didn't quite find that. I think it was a tweet, but I have another one that I can share quickly. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
So basically, this is what I was talking about before. If you want to migrate anything, it's good to understand the relationship between the different entities. So for example, let's say that you have a node and that node has 3, 4, 5 different fields attached to it. Some of those fields are going to live just right in the node. For example, if you have the title, the description, the body field, that's normally when you fetch the information from your source, that is going to be attached right there directly. But in some cases, like with taxonomy terms or images or paragraph or other related things, the node only stores a reference to that other entity. So for example, from your node, you have references to users, you have references to files, you have references to paragraph, and so on, to taxonomy terms. So understanding that relationship is going to help you guide the planning process. For the most part, as I said before, you are going to want separate migrations for each of these different entities, one for nodes, one for users, one for terms, one for files, and one for paragraph. And in some cases, if the migrations are complicated. Well, if not if the migrations are complicated, like if for example, you have multiple paragraphs and data structure among them is very different from one another, you might even go as far as like writing one migration per paragraph type. Sometimes the same way that you will write one migration for each content type, you might do similarly for each paragraph type. And basically this is like, sometimes you will have one migration for one entity, and sometimes you are going to have one migration for each bundle of the entity. So for each paragraph type, for each content type, sometimes for each vocabulary if that needs arises. But basically, it's like I think it was Joe who said that if you can come up with a spreadsheet with your list all your fields and pay close attention to the ones that are reference fields, you need to write separate migrations for those for the most part. One caveat with a paragraph is that those are entity reference revisions, so you actually need two IDs to make the connection. That's something that's the nature of how that works. But that's the main idea. And from there, this is another example. If you want to migrate into media, you have your node, you have the reference to the media, and then from media you have the reference to the file. So if you are able to build this mental model, either in your head or in a piece of paper or in a spreadsheet or something like that, it is going to help you with planning and organizing and knowing how many migrations you have to write. I'm going to look for a tweet with these screenshots to share, but yeah, that's basically what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Mauricio. That's really helpful.
And I had a recent project where they had a bunch of, it was Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migration. They had a bunch of nodes that all had the same structure in their body field. So they didn't have a separate image field attached to the node, but every body field started off with an image and some sort of fixed text. And so when we migrated to Drupal 8, I wanted to make it more structured, pull out those images and attach the images as a separate field, and then be able to theme it more consistently. So so that was the reason I wrote 2 new process plugins, one of which pulls out the URL from the image field so that you can use that to populate a separate field. I'm sorry, it pulls out the URL from the body field, so you can use that to populate the image field. And then a second one that removes it from the body field so that you don't have 2 copies of it. Now that it's in a separate image field, you remove it from the body field. So those are both now in the Migrate Plus module, but currently only in the dev version until the next release comes out.
They don't get re-embedded in the body field, right? They're just separate fields now.
Yeah, now they're separate fields, and the theming of that content type puts them in the right place and makes them responsive and all that good stuff.
You could probably do something similar where you find that URL in the body field and use it to generate a media entity, and then in the body field you could replace the URL with like the Drupal media embed tag during the migration.
Yeah, there are modules that help with that.
Yeah.
I have trouble keeping them straight. There's one Migrate Media Handler, and the other is Media Migrate. And actually, there was just some discussion in the last week that the maintainers of those modules are talking about joining forces. And then once they do that, I won't have to keep them straight.
So I have a question. Is there any way to migrate web forms, or is that something that don't even bother with that. Just start from scratch if you're, if you're moving a Drupal 7 website up to 9.
As far as I know, there's no way to migrate the web forms themselves, but you can migrate the submissions. I've done that on at least one project. The other thing there's no automatic migration for is views. And that's just because there are so many modules that provide additional functionality to views that it's a really hard problem to do it in any sort of reliable and general way.
That's another thing we usually make a spreadsheet of, like all of the views and all of the web forms, or those things that like you have to rebuild in the updated site. And we use that as a way to figure out, like, are we actually using this view? Do we need to recreate this one? Or is this a good time for us to delete it and pretend like it never existed?
Yeah, that's a good point. Any of the easy views are all easy to recreate. All of the more complicated ones, you look at them a year or two after you wrote them, and then you just like, oh no, I have to make that better. I'm not just going to migrate that. I need to rebuild it.
I'm adding the link to the photos. It's actually a tweet with the photos to the document. I guess we are on time, but it is also lunch. So we might as well stay a little bit longer if we want to continue the conversation. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining and sharing your experience. I will try to clean up the path, try to reorder and organize some of the resources, and just tweet a link. And I don't know if we can get some of this in the session description for the conference as well.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mauricio.
Yeah, thanks. This was fun. Thanks for putting the pad up too.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the camp.